Airplanes, more than any other development, have changed the face of war in the 20th century. Among aviation experts, pilots, and enthusiasts, there has long been a spirited debate as to which aircraft, be it a bomber, fighter, or attack craft, is the very best of all time. Join us as we look at superior planes in each aircraft category and finally settle all bets during Airpower Showdown. Attack aircraft. Of all the combat roles airplanes play, the attack aircraft endures perhaps the toughest mission. The pilot and his airplane are down and dirty in the midst of the battle, charging hard at their targets and seeking the quickest way out once their job is done. And unlike the fighter and the bomber, if they don't get their targets, they'll try again and again until they do, or until they run out of ammunition or weapons. And then, after an hour or two of that, they'll refuel, reload, and go back into battle, flying sometimes 2, often more missions in one day. Close air support, as this flying is commonly known, supports the ground troops in their effort to take territory. Wars are fought to capture land or nations, or to defend against such a threat. Bombers, as shocking and devastating as their effects can be, and fighters, as good as they can be at clearing the skies of enemy aircraft, don't take territory. That's the job of ground troops and close air support aircraft. Attack airplanes loaded with guns, rockets, or specialized bombs help them do it. The role of the attack pilot closely parallels the role of the tank commander on the ground. The attack pilot, often in an armored airplane, is assigned targets or prowls for enemy threats, artillery, armored vehicles, mobile missiles, or troops. They are directed to destroy specific enemy assets on the battlefield, roads, bridges, or communications facilities. These pilots are in the middle of battle, exposed for minutes and sometimes hours to hostile fire, from weapons intended to down airplanes or even small arms fire from the enemy below. And they fly at low level, contending with dangerous terrain, towers and wires, or even trees. Bird strikes through the windshield can be a deadly hazard. The nature of the battlefield can make huge differences in the effectiveness of attack missions. In the Persian Gulf, for instance, the desert was the ideal operating terrain for low-level hunters with easy-to-find targets. But for flying attackers in Vietnam, it was just the opposite. Hilly terrain often made attack from the air a challenge. Dense foliage hid enemy troops and equipment. Ultimately, much of the attack mission in Vietnam could not be so precise, so they used napalm to burn the targets hidden below, or Agent Orange to defoliate the forests and jungles, a tactic to keep the enemy from hiding its movements. We're going to take a look at attack aircraft from World War I to today, focusing on those that have been picked as the best in each of 6 eras by a worldwide panel of experts, assembled by the editors of Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. A panel of 25 historians, combat flying veterans, commanders, test pilots, and aircraft designers. Also, a CompuServe forum offered the public the opportunity to vote. By the end of this program, you'll find out which attack aircraft was selected as the best ever. But first, how do you judge attack planes? Just what criteria do the experts use to evaluate their qualities? Survivability is key to the effectiveness of a low-level attack airplane. That means a lot of armor. Without survivability, the airplane and its pilot might as well just stay behind the lines rather than cross over into enemy territory.
I don't know any other airplane that I ever flew or ever saw that could have taken that 20 millimeter right in the nose as we did and still get home. I love that airplane.
Many of the pilots that were hit over there were able to come home because of the way the airplane is built.
The armament the airplane takes with it into battle helps determine how well it completes its task. In World War I, airplanes with 1 or 2 light machine guns took on ground targets. Soon, advanced guns, rockets, and bombs evolved specifically for the ground attack role.
With 850 calibers and the speed of 400 plus miles an hour in a flat glide, we destroy anything in its path. Those 850 calibers would cut a pine tree approximately 12 inches thick, would mow it down like it was a grain of grass.
It had the capability of taking the tanks out, which is what we have with a 30 millimeter. We just don't have a couple hundred rounds. We have 1,150 rounds that we can shoot, and that alone is a weapon that can tear up a lot of metal.
Armament is useless without accuracy. In modern warfare, strike aircraft carry weapons directed by computers and guided by lasers and other electronics, and the pilot aims with elaborate cockpit or helmet instrumentation.
The beauty of the A-10 is we've got a lot of ordnance that we can carry. And then when it comes time to release the ordnance, we've got some precision stuff. We carry the Maverick missile, which is a very accurate weapon, and then the thing everybody that flies the A-10 likes the best is the gun. And that's about as precise as it gets.
The endurance of the airplane, the amount of time it can range across the battlefield before having to return to base for refueling is a measure of its potential.
The A-1 in the Vietnam War had the same advantages it had over other aircraft that it had in the Korean War. It had the range, it had the ability to lauder, could stay on station for a long time, provide support to any group, and remain there and help those people fight the war.
Ultimately, what was the airplane's effect on the ground war? Just how well did attacks from this airplane stop or hamper the enemy? Was the airplane available to be employed when battle commanders needed it? And did the pilot get the job done and come back alive?
If a target happened to come up, a target of opportunity, no matter what it was, we generally had the ordnance mix that we knew we could tangle with it and come out winning with the thing. Never felt apprehensive about it. Always felt like we had the aircraft and the weapons mix to be able to perform the mission and get us back.
Now let's look at the top attack aircraft in each era. The first era, 1910 to 1925. Specialized attack airplanes evolved only in the final year of World War I. Pilots of machine gun-armed reconnaissance planes and reconnaissance escorts found they could harass ground troops with their guns and with grenades or small mortar bombs dropped by the observer. Aiming guns and sighting the bombs was still a crude affair, but the stage was being set. The nominees for Best Attack Airplane of this first era of flight are Sopwith TF-2 Salamander. TF for trench fighter. It was one of the first with armor, 650 pounds worth, surrounding pilot and fuel tank. Halberstadt CL series. It had the lines of a fighter, the punch of a bomber, and a gunner-observer who handled the bombs, grenades, and machine guns. Junkers J-1. Entering service late in the war, this was the first all-metal airplane and featured a chrome nickel steel case around the engine and crew. The best attack aircraft of the World War I era. The Halberstadt CL series airplanes. Germany was the first to deliver dedicated attack airplanes into battle. And the Halberstadt CL-2, developed from an escort mission aircraft, was the first. It was light, made of wood and fabric, but it had the right features. 2 fixed Spandau 7.92 millimeter machine guns pointing forward, and a parabellum machine gun for the observer. It carried grenades or small 22-pound bombs which the observer dropped by hand. It could fly for 3 hours at a time, unusually long for airplanes of the era. Peter Gross is an historian who has chronicled World War I German aviation.
Reconnaissance missions turned out that these were very effective as low-level attack, and you might say like fire engines. They'd say, well, we have a little machine gun nest up here or an artillery position, won't you come over? And they'd go over and they'd pepper it with with machine gun fire and hand grenades.
Peter Kilduff is another World War I historian who interviewed pilots and crew members from the era.
I knew a German observer by the name of Oskar Beckle who flew in Halberstadts, and he told me one time that they used to fly very low to the ground to perform their close air support mission. And I asked him once, how low did you fly? And he said, as low as we had to fly. I said, well, how did you know when you were flying low? And he said, when we would look up and see telegraph wires, that's when we knew we were low.
The interesting thing about these airplanes is that the losses incurred by these squadrons, as far as I've been able to read in German military documents, the losses were relatively light. So either they were very swift in the air, and the Allies had difficulty in shooting them with machine guns or rifles. They didn't give them enough lead time. Anyway, you'd think that flying at 500 feet or 1,000 feet above the lines would be dangerous. The point is, these planes were quite tough, and survival rate was high. So the Halberstadt was certainly a marvelous little airplane. And I've sat in one of those, and I can tell you, the cockpit is like this. I mean, and it's just a little tiny, thin layer of plywood. I mean, there's no feeling of safety in this plane at all. And you have to admire the people who went up in those airplanes.
I once talked to Oskar Beckle and asked him about ground fire. The Halberstadt was not an armored airplane, so he took a precaution of his own. And I said, well, what was the precaution you took? He said, I went to a cast iron stove, I got a big metal plate, and I put it under my seat. And I said, what did the metal plate under your seat do? And he said, well, it assured, for one thing, that later I would have a family. It was a very rugged, very durable airplane, light, quick handling, very responsive. There was good communication between the pilot and the observer, not verbal communication, but they had signals that they used, and they were literally back to back. If you look at the airplane, you'll see that they always sit back to back, and it was very easy for the observer to just turn around, tap his pilot on the shoulder to go one way, tap his pilot another way, give him a hand signal. It was very good cooperation. Good work could be achieved in that airplane.
During the period between 1926 and 1942, many fighter types were adapted for the attack role. There were armored attack versions of Germany's Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. Britain's Hurricane was pressed into service for attack, but two new aircraft dedicated to attack stood out. And nominated for this period are the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. It attacked in Poland and Spain in the 1930s, and its cranked wings and high-pitched whine made it a distinctive and fearsome weapon. Douglas A-20 Havoc. It carried up to 8 nose-mounted half-inch machine guns plus bombs at speeds of nearly 350 miles per hour. The winning attack airplane from this era, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Of all airplanes in the early part of World War II, this one, the Stuka, brought more terror to Germany's enemies than any other.
And the whole concept of ground attack and the idea of having ground attack support infantry never left the Germans. The Stuka was designed specifically to attack, to support attacking ground troops. And the Germans excelled in that.
Werner Roell, a Stuka pilot for the Luftwaffe during World War II, flew 477 missions.
We took along a 250 kilo bomb in the center under the fuselage, and on each side 270 kilo bombs. But on a we always had to take off from grass. So there, we could not exceed the 250. If we had paved runway, we could have taken a 500 and 470. We would not lay down a carpet of bombs. We were the sharpshooters of the bombers. And our targets were bridges, ships, an assembly of tanks,
Its dive characteristics were its most unique feature, able to dive steeply at relatively slow speed.
But you wanted a straight 70-degree angle dive. You took out your brakes, air brakes, so that you would not exceed more than 600 kilometers an hour during the dive. Then one after the other dive down into the target, which I released the bomb at an altitude of 1,000 meters about. And the lower, the better. We had leveled off at about 600-700 meters. Then we would try to get as away from the target as quick as we could. Quite an effective thing.
And there was that noise, that psychologically terrifying wail created by a siren.
The effect of the noise, there was quite some noise made. We had sirens on each side of the wing, and also the bombs had little cardboard whistles. I felt very happy in this aircraft because I knew airplane to attack, to help the infantry, close support for the ground forces. A handsome, easy to maneuver plane, sturdy, it could take a lot of beating, and you could even fly this thing by night on a very primitive grass runway. So this plane was helpful, so we liked it.
The next era of wartime attack aircraft, 1943 to 1946, included the most ferocious battles of World War II, when the industrial heart of every warring nation was devoted to creating more and better machines for battle. Airplanes were at the top of the list, and no period of aircraft development was as productive and creative as this one. The nominees for Best Attack Airplane of this period: Ilyushin-II Shturmovik. It was Russia's best-known attacker and arguably its best airplane of World War II. Over 36,000 of them were built, making it the most produced airplane ever. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Initially sent to war as a fighter, the 7-ton airplane, when equipped with rockets, guns, and bombs, became lethal to anything below. The Douglas A-26 Invader. It evolved from the Douglas A-20 and could have as many as 14 machine guns pointing forward. Models of it flew in 3 wars. Selected as best attacker of this era, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It took a behemoth of an airplane just to carry its 2,000 horsepower 18-cylinder engine. American pilots called it the Jug for its harsh and ungraceful look. 850 caliber guns and the ability to carry 1,500 pounds of bombs and rockets led it to be called by the Germans Jagdbomber, or hunting bomber, Jabo for short. And its fighter design roots made it capable of holding its own in a dogfight. As it turns out, it was an early multi-role airplane, a design that could fight and attack and was a precursor to the great multi-role airplanes of the future. Quentin Annenson trained with the Army Air Forces in 1943 and flew combat for the next 2 years.
The first time I walked up to that P-47 Thunderbolt, I was at Harding Field, Baton Rouge. I had just been commissioned from Luke Field. And when I walked up to that airplane, I couldn't believe the size of this thing. I've never seen anything this big or this impressive. And I thought, you mean to tell me that one man is going to fly this airplane? It looks to me like I could use 2 or 3 other people in my crew. But as I stood there and I looked at that airplane, and 2 or 3 things jumped right out at me. Number one, this was a solid airplane. You could look at the skin of the wings and the fuselage. It was not light, thin, it was a heavy gauge. You could look at that radial engine up front, that big, massive engine. Now that was 18 cylinders in 2 banks, circular banks, one behind the other. and you knew it had power in there. And you looked at the landing gear. The landing gear was wide set, and as I looked at it, heavy duty, great, because with the P-47, knowing what we were going to be doing, that close ground support, we knew we would be making plenty of landings under emergency conditions. So that wide, powerful landing gear was important. But then there was one other thing that caught my attention. I looked up in the cockpit and saw right behind where I would be sitting this about 3/4 of an inch piece of steel behind me. It was armor plate to protect the pilot. And I said, thank God for the designer of this airplane, because I know somebody's going to hit me from the back. And that, as I looked at the whole airplane, there was nothing fragile about that plane. You knew you could go to war in this plane.
And go to war they did, including Milton Sanders, who left the Army as a lieutenant colonel with wartime flying medals from the U.S., France, and Belgium.
The 51s had longer range. They put them with escort and put us in the dirty work down on the treetops. So from there on, it was mostly treetop work. And that we did very nicely. And as one group commander said, you know, he said, that P-47 is the best 500 mile or 400 mile an hour tank buster we have ever seen in this area. Now, our bullets would not penetrate the tank itself, but on a hard road, which the tanks had to be on, we could ricochet underneath, go up their induction system, and then we take care of the crew as they crawled out the top. So no problem.
On one occasion, Quentin Annensen was part of a group of 4 airplanes attacking a German train, moving supplies to the French front.
I saw the flight leader start to make his move, and we all rolled. I was leading the second element. I was taking 2 or 3 cars in the middle, and just as my gun switches were on and I had my bead on that boxcar I was going to hit, the sides of that boxcar came down, and I found myself lying head on into 8 20-millimeter guns. These flak cars were deadly, and you couldn't recognize that they were there or not. If I hadn't had my guns in position and sighted on that flak gun as soon as the sides came down, I probably would never have made it. But as it was, I squeezed the trigger, and at the same time I could see the flashes coming from their guns, see the tracers. And this is all in just an instant or two. And as my bullets hit the flak gun on the right, it's a multiple 4 guns there, and blew the gunners off their seats, at that instant I heard this terrible bang, and I took head on. I took a 20-millimeter. Now, I didn't know how bad the damage was. I didn't know if I was going to be able to keep flying, but the engine sounded terrible. I pulled up, thought I better have room to bail out. But I found I'm still flying. So I pulled off that target and headed as fast as I could back to the base. When I got back and landed, and we looked at that airplane, and it sounded terrible when I was trying to get home. But I was still pulling about 32 inches of manifold pressure. When we landed and looked at that airplane, this 20-millimeter shell had come in head on, just off the cone of the propeller, nicked one piece of the propeller, and had taken 2 cylinders out of my airplane. So the rods are cranking around in there, and there's other damage to that engine. Yet, that airplane flew me home.
Now, the P-47 was a fantastic airplane. It was like, I've flown 51s and others too, but it was like riding in a Cadillac. You had plenty of room in that cockpit. You could reach everything you had to reach very conveniently. Its maneuverability, its ability to sustain damage, and its firepower. What else could you ask? And because of that aircraft, I'm here today. What else can I say?
The 4th era of fighting planes is 1947 to 1960. This era was dominated by developments rooted in the attack successes of World War II. And suddenly, by 1950 and 51, close air support was needed in a new part of the world, Korea. The attack aircraft nominated are the Douglas A-1 Sky Raider. It first flew at the end of World War II, but was still considered a better close support airplane than the more modern jets. The Grumman F-9F Panther flew off carriers for the Navy, carrying 4 20mm cannons and 2 1,000-pound bombs and 6 rockets into battle in Korea. Dassault Mystère 4. Israel, with 60 of the French-built Mystères, used them frequently in their conflicts with Arab states. The winner, the Douglas A-1 Sky Raider. For attack, speed isn't necessarily a strength, and the prop-driven Sky Raider proved that its slow, accurate delivery of weapons made it particularly effective in Korea and later in Vietnam. It could, at low power, fly for up to 10 hours. Paul Hollingsworth, the naval aviator, flew 257 A-1 missions in Vietnam during 1965, 66, and 67.
This airplane is the culmination of all the propeller airplanes that were built, all the lessons that were learned during WW2, and this airplane has all of those embodied within it, and it was used in almost all the missions. The reason this airplane was so good and lasted so long in both the Korean and did so well in both the Korean War and the Vietnam War is because of its ability to carry lots of weapons, bombs, rockets, 20mm cannon, could stay on station for a long time, provide support to any group, and remain there and help those people fight the war.
Dave Eberly, with his A-1 squadron based on the USS Intrepid, also flew during the same period in Vietnam.
Well, I tell you, it was a good airplane to fly. It wasn't an easy airplane to fly. Going off the deck in Vietnam, we always experienced some, you know, we dropped down off the end of the deck. We'd be so loaded up, so you always would stagger off the end of the deck with your bomb load and then gain your altitude and fly it. You had to fly the airplane. It wasn't one of these airplanes where guys fly and say it's hands off. It's a forgiving aircraft. You flew the airplane the whole time. It was one of those airplanes that you had to let the airplane know you were running it and it wasn't flying you.
Its range, its ability to lauder in an area, its firepower, it had 4 20mm cannons in it, and the weapons and bomb load it could carry. It could carry more than its own weight airborne. You could carry up to 13,000 pounds of ordnance on this airplane.
We normally had, when we were doing strikes up north, we'd load up with a mix of bombs and rockets. And the targets we were looking for up there were, if they were strike targets, they were normally bridges, they were railroad marshaling yards, truck convoys, trains. What we were trying to do was to stop the flow of troops and arms south. So we used bombs and we used rockets up north. And of course we had the 20mm in the wings for any targets of opportunity that we might find. We never came back to the ship with ordnance, and we wanted to use everything. Once we hit our strike target, that lingering time allowed us to find a target of opportunity if we could. But that's mostly what we were after, is to knock down bridges, trains, supply lines.
If, while airborne, you got a call that there was some other target that was more vital, a train, troops in combat that needed assistance, the airplane would then be diverted to those targets. After you had expended the ordnance in those targets, if you had any ordnance left, such as the 20mm cannons, and you could call up and say, hey, I have something left, I'm waiting for another target. And then they would assign you another target if they had anything.
One of the toughest A-1 roles was to assist in rescues of pilots who'd been shot down or who'd ejected from their airplanes.
It was particularly good in the Vietnam War as a search and rescue airplane for downed pilots. It was the only aircraft that was capable of providing that sort of firepower required to get the helicopters in and pick up the downed airmen.
Greatest feeling in the world, to know you snatched a guy out of the woods. Greatest feeling in the wood, to know that you provided the ground fire that kept the troops away, and to see that Jolly Green come in and drop that hook and bring a guy up out of the jungle. Worth every minute you spent in there, no matter what you were exposed to. To know you brought a guy back was a real high.
This airplane is the love of my life. I've flown about 25 different airplanes, and this is the one I've probably enjoyed flying the most. I certainly have the most hours in it. I felt very uncomfortable when it went away. I felt very sad that the airplane finally outlived its usefulness, and yes, it's time for it to go, because it's old and slow, but it sure was a hell of an airplane at the time.
Yeah, emotionally tied, you bet. It was a plane that I think it's a piece of my life and always will be.
The next era, 1961 to 1970, changed the face of attack planes. Jets first came into prominence in a close support role. And for American aircraft confronting the war in Vietnam, the hills, dense forests, large geographical area to be covered, combined with the threat of surface-to-air missile fire, put these new designs and their pilots to the test. The aircraft specifically designed for and dedicated to attack that are nominated from this era are the McDonnell Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. They carried more bomb tonnage in Vietnam than any other carrier-based type. Small and maneuverable, it picked up the nickname Scooter. The Grumman A-6 Intruder, designed for deep strike and packed with electronics to assist in its missions, its hallmark was low-level, night, bad weather attack. The Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. It was called the Thud and could deliver bombs at very high speeds. In Vietnam, it went after anti-aircraft missile sites. Winning for this era, the McDonnell Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. The A-4 evolved as the Navy's primary attack aircraft after 1960 and remained in service for more than 3 decades. It had 2 20-millimeter cannons and could carry over 9,000 pounds of bombs. With a lighter load, 4,000 pounds, it could attack over 300 miles away from its ship. Of the carrier-based models, the small, maneuverable Skyhawks dropped more bombs and flew with more squadrons than any other type. David North, a Navy A-4B pilot. His first mission into North Vietnam was to attack an ammunition dump.
So we're going down the valley, and the 6 of us, and we're weaving at about 3,000 feet. Didn't want to get below 3,000 feet because you were in a small ground fire. So we're about 3,500 feet. We're weaving back and forth, and all of a sudden, the whole sky opened up, and it's blue, it's yellow, it's black, which is all different types of AA coming from the North Vietnamese. We get down, we hit our target somewhere close to it, go back to the ship, and said, wow, that was, for our first mission up north, that was a lot of anti-aircraft. And the intelligence officer said, yeah, I meant to tell you that. That's the North Vietnamese training area for their AA gunners. And I said, all I can say was, I'm glad they were students, because we would have been in deep trouble otherwise.
Walt Ulrich, a carrier pilot, also flew missions over Vietnam.
Some of the carriers had the later model A4s that were flying day and night. And if you flew a couple of day missions and a night mission, you were a mighty tired puppy. This was hard on a guy. The North Vietnamese knew where our targets would be and where the choice targets would be. So they would put hundreds of guns around these areas, especially in the areas around their big bridges, and in the areas further north towards Hanoi. So it was always very, very interesting for the Skyhawk pilots. They probably faced more guns and flak than anybody in history over there. It was unbelievable. You never really flew a straight line over North Vietnam. You were always moving a little bit, changing your altitude if you could. We would climb up maybe to 14,000, 15,000 feet initially and cruise in as fast as we could. And maybe 350 knots or so with a loaded airplane, maybe 400. And the object was to pick up speed as you neared the coast and to coast in as fast as you could. And go to your target, and it's more or less a descending type of an approach. The airplane was very survivable. Many of the pilots that were hit over there were able to come home because of the way the airplane is built. There were holes in the wing of some of these gentlemen where you could stand 2 people up inside the wing there. And the holes were like this, and yet the airplane would fly back.
I did take one hit up north near Vin on a strike, and it went through the flap. I think it was a 37 millimeter that didn't go off, fortunately for me. But I always felt comfortable about the 8.4 because I knew it would get me back. And I think that most pilots who flew it, it did do very well. It was a fun airplane to fly as a pilot. It was reliable. In my 2,500 hours, I lost one engine once, and that was a fuel control that I was able to switch. I had one hydraulic failure, and that was it. So it was a very reliable airplane. It could carry a lot. It was small. It was agile. No, I think that in its time, I mean, its time is gone by now, but in its time, it was the best attack airplane going.
The airplane was absolutely super. I think the pilots enjoyed flying it. They really loved the airplane, and being a Skyhawk pilot was really it. That's where the action was.
The current era for attack aircraft, from 1971 to the present, resulted in the development of two distinct types of attack aircraft. Those for low, slow flight over the battlefield, and those for high-speed, pinpoint targeting, getting in, hitting, and out fast, the strike mission. 3 aircraft were nominated as best of this period. British Aerospace Harrier. This vertical takeoff and landing jet is also made by McDonnell Douglas for use by the United States Marines. Fairchild A-10 Thunderbolt II. This was the first dedicated attacker built for the Air Force in more than 2 decades. The A-10 is built around its deadly 7-barreled cannon. McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet, F for fighter, A for attack. A single pilot jet with all the electronics and weapons that the pilot could ask for to handle both roles. Winning the vote for best attacker of the current era, the Fairchild A-10 Thunderbolt II. Rugged, slow, and able to survive. Protecting the pilot, a titanium bathtub wraps under the cockpit. Its engines are set wide apart and placed to make them less apparent to heat-seeking missiles. There's plenty of fuel to hang over the battlefield, and from its 11 pylons, it can carry 16,000 pounds of bombs and rockets, including the Maverick with TV or infrared camera guidance to pinpoint a target. And then there's the A-10's gun, the GAU-8 called the Avenger. It fires 30-millimeter shells, each weighing 1.6 pounds and each capable of piercing the thickest tank armor. They fire at a rate of 4,000 rounds a minute. The A-10 has gained the name Warthog, and in the Persian Gulf War, ranged over the battlefield every day, hunting Scuds and busting tanks. Pilots now with the 104th Fighter Squadron of the Maryland Air National Guard flew there, and more recently in Bosnia.
Well suited to the mission in Bosnia because it's got a long loiter time. Our job over there is really to hang out and wait, and if we're needed, then the guys on the ground are going to let us know that. And in the meantime, we just hang out and wait. We can carry a lot of ordnance, so we've got the loiter time and we've got the ordnance to wait out any situation, and then in the event something happens, you know, we can help them out.
A guy in our unit employed when the Serbs were taking some of the stuff out of the UN containment area. It was low ceilings and mountainous terrain, and we were able to work in it. He employed the gun. It was very effective, and after they shot that artillery piece, the Serbs had a change of heart and returned what was taken. So it proved very effective, and many times over there during several of the deployments we've been over there, it might sound a little funny, but our mission was to make noise. If they knew we were overhead, it gave them a new reality on the ground, what they had to work with, and usually things would settle down when they knew A-10s were overhead. So we have kind of a little reputation, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
In Desert Storm, we were mostly concentrating on armor targets, tanks. Artillery was a large target. There was a lot of Iraqi artillery. And then trucks and other targets of opportunity that we happen to find, but mostly I'd say armor and artillery. I think the gun for the missions that we fly these days, both in Desert Storm and in Iraq, is an excellent weapon because it can pinpoint a target like no other weapon, really. it's surgical. You know, we find the target that we want to hit, and now with the improved avionics that are in the A-10 that help us target, we're relatively sure we can take that target out.
It's a very easy airplane to fly. It's very hard to, as we say, bite yourself. It's very true, and it talks to you well. What I mean is, you don't find yourself in an unexpected situation. If you get yourself in trouble, you should have seen it coming. It's got a big old stick. We kind of call it the last genuine stick and rudder airplane still flying. Underpowered at times, temperature dependent, and how much your bomb load is really affects the aircraft performance. But on a cool day with a moderately light bomb load, it's a real pleasure to fly. Somebody designed an airplane really well for the attack mission. And the attack mission, unlike the strategic strike, you're going to be exposed to a lot of small arms, medium arms, and the smaller surface-to-air missiles. They designed it to take punishment and to get the guy home. Yeah, we had a lot of confidence in the airplane.
I chose to stay with the A-10 because the A-10 is going to be involved. If anything happens anywhere, the A-10's the workhorse, and it's going to be involved. I like that about it.
Oh, I love the airplane. It's great for the Guard. It was good in the active duty. And it's got several things that most of us like. We knew it had a capability. It's one of those things that until you get to prove yourself, which we've done a couple times now, we know what the capability is, but the rest of the world's kind of naive to what it can really do.
So here are the winners in each era. The finalist for Best Attack Aircraft, Halberstadt CL Series, Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, Douglas A-1 Sky Raider, McDonnell Douglas A-4 Skyhawk, Fairchild A-10 Thunderbolt II, and the overall winner, the best attack aircraft of all time, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. For its time, it was by far the best attack aircraft. The Jug put more bombs and bullets on target during World War II than any other American or British single-engine attack airplane. And how did it meet the criteria to become the winning aircraft? Survivability. At 7 tons, with double thick skin, extra armor in key areas, and an 18-cylinder air-cooled engine, the P-47 was not easy prey. Pilots who flew severely shot-up Thunderbolts home swore they'd never fly another aircraft in combat. P-47s went on 423,435 sorties during World War II and suffered only 3,077 losses, less than 1%. Endurance was not a big factor in the European theater since temporary airfields moved along the battle lines. Nonetheless, when called for, the P-47 could fly for 4 to 5 hours at a time. Armament. 8 50 caliber guns and the ability to carry more than 1,500 pounds of rockets and bombs gave the Thunderbolt pilot the right option for the target. Armament is nothing without accuracy. Because the aircraft was essentially a flying tank, it could push closer to its targets and take more time to aim. Its shooting distance was usually only a few hundred yards. Its effect on the ground war? Most of the 9th Air Force's attacks in World War II came from P-47s. The record, over 61,000 trucks and troop vehicles destroyed. Over 8,000 tanks taken out, 8,400 locomotives and 94,000 rail cars decimated, 5,000 artillery nests and 688 bridges. And on one occasion, P-47s were the sole attackers against a battalion of German troops. The P-47s strafed and bombed until the Germans surrendered to units of the 9th Air Force.
The first time in history that an air group has forced 20,000 German soldiers and all their equipment to surrender. The first time in history that this has ever happened without ground support. And our 406 fighter group, the 9th Air Force, did it.
Historians agree that the P-47 was the tool that gave General Patton and his armies what they needed at the time to push the Germans back and wrap up the war in Europe.
When the breakout of Normandy came, we were told that our job was to protect the right flank of Patton's armored divisions. Now you think about that. Normally, armies have to protect their flanks and they have to move into position. But we from the air, the Thunderbolt pilots, were to protect his right flank. We could have walked on air. We felt so proud of our assignment. Well, I can't think of anything that came close to the low-level work capability of the P-47 Thunderbolt. It could do things that I haven't seen any other plane do in such a total capability of performing that it just was mind-boggling to see what this could do. I would say definitely the P-47 Thunderbolt was the best attack airplane of all time. When you went into combat with that airplane, you knew you were going into a very deadly world. But the degree of confidence that you had in the airplane was so strong that it let you do your job with greater aggressiveness and press the attack home. As a result of all this, I feel literally that if I had not been flying the P-47 Thunderbolt in the war I was fighting, that I wouldn't be here today. I think it saved my life. And I think 90% of the close support Thunderbolt pilots you talk to will say that same thing.
To begin to get a glimpse of the future of ground attack airplanes, take a closer look at derivatives of current fighters. The F-16 and F-15, for example. The McDonnell Douglas F-15E Strike Eagle and its weapons proved their attack capabilities in the Persian Gulf only a year after squadrons started flying it. One of the most deadly devices available on the E model is called the Lantern System for low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night. For navigation, the system allows the pilot to pick a route at low altitude in total darkness. The weapons officer who sits behind the pilot picks out targets with a laser designator, in effect a pointer. After release, a laser-guided bomb follows the laser spot to the target. With such capabilities, anything that can be seen or recognized by an infrared sensor can be hit. Near the end of Desert Storm, as thousands of Iraqi troops fled Kuwait, General Buster Glosson, now retired, who directed air operations, desperately sought a way to go after them.
And the weather at that time was between 300 feet and 1,500 feet, light mist, and very difficult to stop a column of vehicles trying to escape north back into Iraq. And so those fighter pilots that took off from the base in Saudi Arabia, the F-15Es from Seymour Johnson, North Carolina, they went under the weather and did that mission that night. Was certainly one of the high points, but also the most tense moments of the war for me.
In the near future, the F-15E, as well as F-16s that can be similarly equipped for ground attack missions, and the F-A-18 will remain key to high-speed, low-level strike. And certainly, the F-117A stealth fighter, with its capability to fly undetected by radar to a target, can be a key player despite its limited bomb-carrying capability. And for close air support, assisting troops on the battlefield, the A-10, the Air Force says, will be around for at least another 2 decades. General Joseph Ralston is the Air Force member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Well, first of all, the A-10 is our primary close air support airplane, and I believe that as far as we can see into the future, we will have the A-10 flying. But ultimately, it'll be replaced by the Joint Strike Fighter. I think the Joint Strike Fighter will be our primary multi-role airplane for the 21st century. It will replace the F-16 for the Air Force, replace the A-10 at some time, and will replace at some point the Harrier for the Marine Corps. It'll replace the F-18 for the Navy. I think the Joint Strike Fighter will be in the fleet late in the first decade of the 21st century, sometime between 2007 and 2010. It will be our primary multi-role aircraft. It will be a very maneuverable airplane. It should have a high degree of stealth technology involved. It'll be able to drop air-to-air or air-to-ground ordnance and shoot air-to-air ordnance. Whether or not all of them will be exactly the same, probably not for each of the services, but I think they will be very, very similar. A high degree of commonality is what we're shooting for between the Marine airplane, the Air Force airplane, and the Navy airplane.
Strike airplanes, their weapons, and the task of the pilots and weapons officers will surely change. But as long as there are troops battling on the ground, there will be ground support airplanes, assisting those troops and trying to slow or halt enemy movements and supply lines. Despite stealth and all the other new techniques and equipment, there will be those times, the tough days of dangerous, gritty warfare, when aircraft and their crews will have to get close, risking ground fire and missile threats in order to get to and take out their targets. Those pilots can only hope that, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, the more modern aircraft assigned to the attack role will do the job and protect the pilot, as well as the 7-ton, 2,000 horsepower prop airplane that helped turn the tide of World War II.